Hello there, English 315 online students. This is your professor speaking, and I wanted to give you a brief introduction to the readings you're doing this week and to anticipate the video recording you're doing over the weekend. And I hope the course is going well for you, by the way, and I enjoyed getting to know you via your posts and your writings thus far. So shift forward a couple hundred years from Beowulf to Chaucer and now to roughly 17th century English poetry. I'm guessing you've read some of the schools that we're studying this week. That would be the metaphysical school that George Herbert represents. If you don't know what I mean, it's just dense intellectual poetry with difficult symbolism and antithetical ideas balanced, like in John Donne's poetry or in, as you read, George Herbert's The Collar. But the idea would be you also read Cavalier poetry from George Herrick, as well from Andrew Marvell to his Coy Mistress, and Cavalier poetry is very light. It has a tone of carpe diem, for lack of a better term, and they often have kind of sexual references, which is strange. You think about the 17th century, and it has all of that. Some terms this week just to think about is that the poetry, the female poetry, is done in the Petrarchan sonnet tradition that is with the traditional 14 lines, and you certainly see that in the longer work that you read. You also see some of the, as I said, the Cavalier poetry. You also see the metaphysical poetry, and you see other techniques involved in the poems you did. So let me show you this in case you don't have the book or available. If you can see it, that is the painting, the one that, not this one, excuse me, this one up here is the family of Lady Sidney, a relative of Lady Mary Roth, who has the poet Philip Sidney, who invents of poetry as their kind of the better known family figure in that group of writers. But you note immediately, and the image says this, that the mother is touching the sons and the girls are in pairs. It's portraiture, so often portraiture is not that interesting. But this piece, Mary Sidney as one of the children is being depicted there. Sorry, I'm a little hoarse this week, but the idea is that the children, the males, are being emphasized. There's no husband present, right, and that's implied there, and you get this notion that the females are less valuable. The pairing's strange, as if they're to be married off in pairs. Imagine that the boys, you could barely tell, are male in their attire, upper class British society, and again, it probably portends the way that a woman is expected to be the domestic life of a female, and that's why the work this week from Phillips, as well as Lady Mary Roth, complicates our notions. They're complicated ideas of love. And I guess we could start with Phillips's married state, Catherine Phillips, on 987 in your book. And I'm going to look at a couple poems. This will not be a long speech. One of the things I'm asking for this week is for you to articulate the connections between some of these poems together. And I think some of them will be rather obvious to you. But one of the things that you'll immediately note would be the role of marriage, the role of domesticity, and even in the religious poetry, like George Herbert's The Collar, this sense of an intense longing. His longing is to give up his faith, and it's very easy to read The Collar as being a love poem at first. It's this intense kind of sense of betrothal to another that the speaker has with divinity, and the collar is the collar of priestly garb that's worn. But the point is that each of these pieces, including the domestic female work, including the Cavalier work, which there really isn't too much ambivalence there. It's to the virgins make much of time. In other words, go and be merry and have sex before time runs out. Maybe there's not as much ambivalence there, but in the love poetry by the female poets, as well as The Collar, there's a sense of longing. Maybe it's the body and the soul is being in contrast or yoking one another in different directions. And for Herbert, that's one of the very interesting parts of his poetry and the metaphysical poetry. They often have antithetical ideas balanced together in that respect. But if we look at a married state, this is surprising. And some of the works I've assigned this semester, including a diary later on, including a slave narrative to end the class, um, are give us an intense portrayal of the intimate interior life of British writers and the real world, like not just polite genteel poetry. A Married State is somewhat polite and genteel in terms of its literary form, but look at what she writes about being married. A married state affords but little ease. The best of husbands are so hard to please. Look at the rhyme scheme, by the way. A. This in wise, careful faces you may spell, though they dissemble their misfortunes well. A virgin state is crowned with much content. It's always happy as it's innocent. Um, this is a strikingly shocking poem for its portrayal of women. Women are dissembling, are putting on a face. You dissemble. If a person is dissembling, they're putting on a lie, a show, and they're pretending their contentment. But it's the idealization of virginity that I think she's saying is part and parcel of the problem. It's innocent there, and she ends it by saying, turn apostate to love's levity." Almost a rejection of love, like an apostate, you reject a religious creed. Suppress wild nature if she'd rebel. There's no such thing as leading apes in hell. And there's that odd footnote about that's what happens to spinsters, right? They if you, older women who never marry and consummate a relationship sexually, they're going to lead apes in one of the layers of hell. That's a side point, but the idea would be this is a powerful poem that strikingly portrays a unhappy state of marriage for a woman, and so the virginity that's sought for in the male poems, right, to his coy mistress, um, Andrew Marvell, and you also get George Herrick's "To the Virgins Make Much of Time." The way that these poems portray love, and I'm going to find a good page for you. Give me 1 second. On 959 in your book, take a look with me, please. On 959 in your book, this is one that just stays off the tongue. It's such a light, cavalier, right, easygoing poem by George Herrick and George Herbert, I should say. Sorry, George Herbert, Robert Herrick, by Robert Herrick. And you get this idea, gather ye rosebuds while you may, old time is still a-flying, that same rosebud, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. You know, in that quatrain, right, the 4-line stanza, that it's a statement of time and the rapidity of time, which we often get in these metaphysical poems, including with John Donne's work. And it ends with this notion, right? Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. I mean, tarry, you're going to forever wait your ability to marry. The idea is to marry to then have sex rather than anything else, I think, here. But all these references to time passing, and this is the same thing that you get in To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, would be that time's running out. The lamp of time is often a literary symbol or trope in metaphysical poetry and in cavalier poetry and poetry in general. I can think of lots of lamps in poetry. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun he's getting, the higher he's getting, the sooner his race will be run, and the nearer he's to setting. So make much of your time, virgins, and consummate your relationships through marriage and sex. It seems to be the way of saying it. And prime, heaven forbid, we get old and we haven't experienced worldly pleasures in that respect. There's not much ambivalence there. I may be wrong in the way that I'm looking at these works together in terms of longing with some type of social decorum, religious belief, cultural norms such as marriage, kind of confining the speaker, as in Catherine Phillips' poem, A Married State. In this one, the antithetical ideas that balance them out, and this is key to kind of 17th century poetry, find those antithetical ideas, will be time, marriage, a social convention, and the flesh, right? The soul and the flesh are often at odds in these poems. There's not much of an odd or I should say ambivalence, as I said, with Robert Herrick then. If you want something a little bit more complex, maybe poetically, you can look at, this is the next to last poem I'm going to look at for a moment, and that would be George Herbert's work, The Collar. Um, it starts with this cry from the first person speaker. We got many of these poems are kind of these first person intimate poems. Uh, I struck the board and cried no more. I will abroad. What shall I ever sigh and pine? My lines in life are free, free as the road, loose as the wind, and large as a store. And I noticed when reading this that it doesn't have the strict rhyme scheme that some of the 14 line sonnets have, right? The A B B A or the A B A B that we get, right? Those are the rhyme schemes in the sonnets with a rhyming couplet, or in 4 line couplet sometimes, but a rhyming couplet at the end. But in this one, it's a very plaintive cry that if you think, what is he crying for? Is it the flesh like Marvell and like Herrick? No, it's the idea that will I ever sigh and pine, and that's for unification with the divine, and we know that from the final 2 lines. Methoughts I heard one calling, child, and I replied, my lord. Lines 35 and 36. The idea would be he's crying because he can't give up his faith. He wants to go abroad, right? So the metaphor. Look for the overarching poetic conceit in metaphysical poetry. The metaphor is he can't go abroad and travel in freedom because of his belief, though he wants to give up his pining and his sighing and all those things as someone who's wearing um, the collar, metaphorically and literally. He finds solace at the end, and it's through someone calling it's God, of course, calling my child. So his sense of his beliefs are affirmed, and there's this dialogue there that you get at the end as well. But you get some interesting tension even between the non-erotic love of divine poems, as in The Collar. And I'll end very briefly. I'm asking you to read from a larger work from Lady Mary Roth, right? The one of the children pictured in the painting of the Sidney family that I showed you at the beginning. It becomes a decently known poet and published the longer work that this is an excerpt from. But if you look at sonnet number 77, right? Sonnet 77, um, of Pamphylia to Amphilanthus, excuse me, on 945 in your book. Say that 5 times. On 945 in your book. The beautiful part of this kind of selection of collective sonnets published as this larger one is that there's again that beautiful tension, that beautiful ambivalence, and that sense that she's striking for love um, as an abstract concept. And there is, I think, from reading these sonnets, that awareness of the physical aspect of love. But love is this kind of interesting thread. She just says, in this strange labyrinth, how shall I turn? Again, first person, use of the rhetorical first person. Ways are on all sides, while the way I miss. If to the right hand, there in love I burn, let me go forward, therein danger is. If to the left, suspicion hinders bliss, let me turn back. Shame cries I ought to return, nor faint though crosses with my fortune's kiss. Um, if you look at look at the translated notes, I teach this material, and I certainly need to look at some of the translated words that's next to the small circle in your Broadview anthology. Um, she describes love and her emotions as a labyrinth, and she ends it with a conceit. Look at the larger poetic analogy of Ariadne, the weaver or thread of time and of human fate. So it's a wonderful analogy, and there's not that resolution, right? She's searching to the left. There might be bliss. Um, she might turn back and then feel ashamed. She says, um, and fortune's kiss stand still is harder, although short to mourn. She's depicting it as a path that she has to choose, and there doesn't seem to be a right way. It does feel a bit like Robert Frost's poem, in his more famous study of paths, I should say. Um, but anyway, in this one, her doubts, her self-doubt, her sense of it will bliss lead me, will love lead me to bliss, will love in the if to the right hand, there in love I burn. It's an interesting metaphor of a reference to burn of is the burn of a good kind, usually not. So it's a very cautious way that she's looking at her heart, which is uncontrollable, kind of leading her down different paths. That's a very she and Herbert, that is Lady Mary Roth and Herbert, are some of the more interesting poems I think for this week. I think you'll see Choose Coy Mistress and uh, uh, Gather the Virgins poem. Sorry, I'm trying to do five things at once. To the Virgins make much of time. I think you'll see the same sensibility within them. Look at the painting that I asked you to read to look at as well, and look at the family dynamics. I think it's certainly the case that much of the readings this week deal with family, domesticity, expected gender roles, and the limits therein in the 17th century. So I've prattled on, and I hope that this talk was helpful, and I wish you well with this week's work. Nice talking to you.